Hello YouTube, it's your friendly neighborhood bedroom programmer. Last episode we went through the basics of resources that you could use for questions about in-depth pieces of code, for where you could get your compiler, etc. Today we're actually going to do a short rundown of the different data types that you will encounter. Your first data type that we'll talk about, you'll see I've typed a bit of information in here already. The first data type we'll talk about is the int data type. Int is short for integer. It is any whole number, positive to negative. It does have a maximum value. The maximum value, depending on how you use it, if you're just using it like this, is somewhere around, if I recall correctly, 2 billion. Long, and I say this is the same way, long is just another version of int. It is actually short for long integer. Now there's an interesting thing that happens usually when you multiply an integer by an integer. So if you do 10 times 10, usually, because of a quirk of how the low-level programming language works, this result will be stored in a long. Sometimes that'll cause a warning. The only difference between an int and a long is that a long takes double the memory. Float, these are for, it's called float because it uses a floating point. This decimal point can be anywhere in here. And just as with float, you have double. And double is the same, or has the same relationship with float as long does to int. Double uses a double the memory that a float variable does. And again, if you were to multiply a double by a float by a float, excuse me, you will usually wind up with a double data type value. And sometimes it'll cause an issue. Now, what if you tried to do this? What if you tried to put a 0.2 at the end of an integer value? The computer would read the 1 and the 0 and say, yep, that's a 10. But it'd say decimal place, I don't know what that is, and it would drop that. It will not round it. It will drop it. So if you had 10.6, that would still be dropped down to 10. We have Boolean values, which are shortened to bool. And for those of you who do not know what a Boolean value is, a Boolean value is what you think of when you think of computer code. It is either a 1 or a 0, or in the case of C++ to allow greater readability, a true or a false. You have string, which is any collection of characters. Anything within these quotation marks will be taken to be the assigning value to this variable. And character, or shortened to C or char, instead of using double quotes like the string does, it uses single quotes, and the IDE color codes it differently. Some of you who know more about programming may be saying these are invalid ways of categorizing data, and that's true. See, each of these are the data types, but we don't use the data types directly usually. In some cases we do, but we're not there yet. So what we use things called variables. This is a valid declaration, and what this means is that wherever this is called, at least the first time, it means 10. Now, you can do variable plus 10, and then var1 or var1 plus 10, and then var1 will equal 20. See, that's why it's called a variable. It's just like in mathematics, and that's the case with all of these. Now, there are some conventions for naming a variable, and one of those conventions is that we start with a lowercase letter. If it's more than one word, we typically use what's called camel casing, where the second word is capitalized. However, there are some things you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to start a variable with a numeral. You notice that this doesn't change the color code. It didn't turn to black there. If I was to try to run this would cause an error. You also cannot have a space in your variable name. You cannot have any special characters in your variable name either. And that will be all for right now. In the next episode, we will actually finally write real working code. Hope to see you then.